Okay, let's talk about stitching. One of the biggest things you'll need to do. So let's go ahead and open up AVP. We'll go ahead and drag and drop videos here, or we can open the project, but since we're just starting out, I'll Command Tab over here to Finder and pull in just our clips. And if you remember, we've already got our frame offset stuff figured out and saved, ready to go. So it'll bring up in all of our clips, all ready to go. We don't have them synchronized yet though, so we got to remember, before we stitch, you have to synchronize. Okay, now that we're synchronized, you can come on over to the Stitch tab here, and it will bring up your information. Now before we dive in, I'll just talk quickly about what all of these mean. This is your Stitch As window, where you can choose how you want AVP to treat your videos. If you recorded with the GoPro Hero 3 Plus or 4, you obviously want to keep it at this. There's also an option for Hero 3, and then there's a few other mixed camera models and stuff that AVP officially supports. This is also not an exhaustive list. You can stitch any kind of 360 video shot with any camera system with AVP. These are just the kind of preset stuff if you want a really quick one-click way to get everything ready. You also have a template panorama, which basically allows you to choose a pano file that you can stitch from. Say you've shot everything in one room on one camera setup, but you have multiple projects or multiple setups or something. You can basically do all your stitching once, all the hard work once, and then bring it back in to your other project files and use that same template, use that same panorama information to apply it to further clips. This is pretty rare. I haven't really had to use this a lot. This is also useful if you're shooting underwater stuff. What I would recommend with shooting underwater footage is shoot a little bit of footage above water, really high up, so you can get a good baseline, and then do a stitch on that, and then you can export that panorama and use that stitching information on another project underwater when there might not be as much detail. You can also choose lens model, and what that allows you to do is set up your exact lens length. You can choose different lens types, fisheye or standard. So this is pretty cool too if you're shooting with a completely custom rig, like if you're shooting with a Blackmagic Mini or like a Red, for instance. I've seen those done before, which is cool, and Autopan video supports setting up a very custom stitch if you'd like. But for the most part, we won't be needing to refer to this. So I'll just leave it as GoPro Hero 3 Plus or 4, since that's what we shot with. And then this is kind of the big one as well, your Stitch At area that you can choose either current position or current selection. Current selection is also known as range stitching. So what current position does is you basically choose a point on your timeline with your blue scrubber here, and you'll see that these actually live update with that. As I'm scrubbing through, you can kind of get an idea of what each of your cameras is seeing, and you're not stitched yet, so you're still just going to see them as 6 individual clips. But what I like to do is I usually choose an area kind of in the middle that's very representative of my entire shot, right? So this shot is me just walking away from this temple towards these gazebos down at the bottom of the hill. So with this shot, it's a pretty good example of something that stays similar throughout the entire shot. I'm not really changing elevation or moving quickly through doors or tight spaces and then all of a sudden into open spaces. It's all one pretty much similar shot. So even if I'm walking, the spatial and the physics of the location aren't changing rapidly or anything. So I don't need to worry about any other problems there. So I usually like to just choose one point that's representative of my entire shot. And that's what this current position does. When I click stitch with current position selected, it's only gonna look at these 6 images here and use that information to stitch together your videos. Current selection, however, actually takes a look at everything that's inside of this blue current selection. So with current selection, what you can actually do is click and drag the ends of this blue selection area to an area that you want to use as your stitch. So the reason you'd want to pull this in a little bit is usually for the first few seconds you're setting up the camera, you're getting things, you're hitting record on the cameras, you're not quite ready in your ready position. So I usually like to leave out quite a bit of that just to be safe, and then I usually come into the really central kind of meat portion of my shot. And you can then stitch off that. So once you have your blue area set up with current selection, the cool thing is you can then tell Autopan video to basically go in this amount of time, so 10 for instance. You can say go throughout this timeline equally and choose 10 points to make a panorama from. And then average all that out and make the best possible overall stitch that you can. So this is great for really complex, like underwater stuff, or say you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of detail for Autopan video to latch onto. You can basically come in and say, now I want you to look, instead of looking at just one point on the timeline, I want you to look at 10 or 15 within this blue area. So you can be pretty precise on where you want AVP to look. You can be really specific. I use these a lot for mastering and polishing up my shots. However, as you can assume, this takes quite a bit longer than just stitching at the current position. So current position and current selection have both really good use cases. Current selection is great for stuff that's hard to see, there's not a lot of detail. You want to give AVP as much detail and information as possible. Current position is good for unchanging shots, just like this clip here. And this compute RMS curves option will come later. We can talk about that in a minute. So for this, I'm going to show you what current position does, and we're going to go ahead and hit stitch. And you can see that the program is telling us creating one reference panorama down at the bottom left there, and this is our progress bar. If you do want to abort, you can click that button there, which is nice. And then you'll see this start to load. The real-time preview window will come up automatically. And once it's done, you'll kind of see this weird ski-wampus image, right? So that is our equirectangular preview of what our stitch gave us. In addition to stitching based off of your current position and the current selection, there's another way called adaptive stitching that uses keyframes and kind of adjusting things in the timeline to basically change your stitch based off of the time in your timeline. And I'll show you how to do that right now. This is a little bit more of a complex shot at the same shoot that I did at the Color Festival. Basically this shot is of me out in the crowd here, and there's another little portion of the clip at the beginning where I'm underneath this gazebo here while one of the chalk throws is going on. So I'm going to go ahead and do a current position stitch based off of this point in time out here while I'm out in the middle of the crowd. So with adaptive stitching, what you can do is you can actually enable this cutter tool here, or just hit the C key on your keyboard, and you can create 2 points in time basically, where this is a keyframe and this is a keyframe. And when you go to this keyframe, you can basically say stitch in this area right here on this current position, and then at this point I want it to be this stitch. So you can kind of adjust your stitching as you go. All right, now in this same project, this is a timeline that I've done for the project that we actually exported, but you can see in this clip here that I have plenty of keyframes down here that say I want to adjust the stitching based off of time within this timeline here. So when I'm out here in the crowd, moving around, kind of seeing everybody, the math and the algorithms that go with this stitch are going to be much different than when I'm in a closer, tight space like this. So I can basically adjust these keyframes to go from each point in time. I can really fine-tune that stitching. So especially when I switch locations and I'm moving around, and this is obviously stuff I wouldn't be using because it's really shaky and stuff, but you can kind of get an idea of how the stitching math and all the seams change when I go to a different location or when I'm moving around. And that's really the beneficial part of keyframing, is when you have one shot, one continuous shot like this that you want to adjust the stitching for, you can keyframe different stitching methods throughout your clip.